I'm Richard Pyatt. Welcome to the BC City Connection, the official podcast from the city of Battle Creek, City Hall in downtown. In fact, here as we speak, in the beginning of 2026, we're reserving some episodes from now through the end of the year focused on housing. If you've been with us over the course of a number of episodes, or you've done your own research, certainly read other stories, watched other stories, you're probably aware that there is a housing shortage. Really, it's a national problem, but we feel it here too in Battle Creek. So our extra episodes in 2026, approximately one a month, will focus on the issue of housing and what's happening therein. Joining us today is the planning supervisor in the city of Battle Creek, Darcy Schmitt, to talk about where we are right now. Hi, Darcy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. Let's talk for a second about what a planning supervisor does, just to have an understanding of what your purview is.
Great. I have a team of wonderful people that help me work on anything that has to do with land use. We take a look at how where housing, where commercial, things like that are located. We utilize the master plan. Right now, we are working from the 2018 master plan, and we help to implement that plan. We help developers with development projects, whether it's from a beginning, talking to them about a potential site, what they need to do to get approval for the site plan, what they need to get approval for, who they need to speak with for public works, water hookup, and actual construction drawings. So we do a little bit of everything.
Yeah. And by the way, the master plan is updated on a certain cadence, isn't it?
It is. We look at it every 5 years. That doesn't mean the entire plan is updated, but components of the plan are updated. So it's very important to do that, to keep it fresh and make sure we're moving forward for the city.
Well, by that description, we can understand then that if there is a concerted effort to add structures, living structures to the area within the city limits, then certainly your department is going to be involved at some point in helping to make that happen. What's already happening in this way, Darcy, now?
That's a good question. We have implemented already some of the recommendations from the 2018 plan. In 2020, the city actually developed three new mixed-use zoning districts. And by mixed use, basically, they're allowing housing and commercial uses either on the same property or within the same building. That creates a lot of flexibility for market needs. So, some of the housing that has been looked at and starting to be created are primarily along major corridors.
Yes, and this kind of design too is I would venture to say somewhat modern, isn't it? The notion of the mixed use.
Yes.
We have many of us have lived in neighborhoods, I suppose
Right.
subdivisions as we used to call it, where it's house, 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 and if you want to go to a retail establishment, you're going to go out of that neighborhood and go somewhere else.
Correct.
Whereas the mixed use example is one that I think has become, correct me if I'm wrong, more popular now, where folks have, I don't know, I think of New York City or something. When we think about living in a residential space that's connected to some kind of retail space or restaurant or some other kind of business, is this new? I'm looking at it like it's new.
It's new, but it's actually old.
Yeah.
The old downtowns used to have mixed use. The edges of the neighborhoods had, neighborhood stores and businesses in close proximity. Then we became very car centric, and that became the usual. People didn't want to walk. Now we're kind of in an era where people want to walk and some people have to walk. Some people have to use the non-motorized transportation system as in the bus system, and they count on having walkability or housing where they can walk to these businesses and get their basic needs taken care of.
So this is a significant example of what we can expect to see as more structures, living structures and otherwise, are built in Battle Creek?
That's correct.
All right. So, in that regard, where are we in this, just generally speaking, in this goal? I mean, do we have a sense for what kind of mixed use developments will happen or would we like to have happen? Where are we with that?
Yeah. Well, it's actually just beginning to take off, which is very exciting to see. We have one project that has been in the works for several years to get the financing and get approvals. It is a mixed use project that is looking at building a 4-story building. That building would have 80 apartment units in phase one. It would also include a building that has a community building and a daycare for use of the community, but as well as those that are living in the building. That would be phase one. Phase two would be townhome units. And there are proposed 16 townhome units with 3 bedrooms. And the really wonderful part is that 48 of the units would be reserved for low to moderate income, and 48 would be for market rate. So it's a really mixed income project as well as a mixed use project, and it
And
will
those
be
are rentals?
those are
Those are,
rentals,
yeah.
yes, yes, and it's in an area that scored high in the walkability and having resources close by with the bus system, and it should start the first phase this year.
Okay. So you're focused then on sectors of the city and understanding what the needs are in those sectors and then trying to encourage development that addresses that. Is that fair?
That's fair. That's
How
correct.
do you go about that?
It's you have to take the obstacles away first, and that's what this zoning has done, right? Once the obstacles are gone and the community has had time to weigh in on that, these are things that were discussed during the 2018 plan. The developers all of a sudden don't have that obstacle. They have more opportunities. They have the ability to make the numbers work. We already have a difficult time. We have a shortage of construction and tradespeople everywhere. But Michigan has lost quite a few. So we have to get rid of any obstacles that we can to development. Otherwise, we're going to have a difficult time with getting housing for this in the city, even with the amazing assets that we have.
Yeah. And you looked at it as well in terms of sectors, right? The different districts that you were focused on. Is that true?
That's true. A lot of these changes for the mixed use, again, were in areas that were on the edge of single family neighborhoods that maybe have changed character over time because of the traffic. And it doesn't make sense anymore to have the large setbacks that you would normally have in a single family residential neighborhood. The houses were underutilized. So redeveloping them into more housing units and maybe an opportunity to have a coffee shop on the first floor. So, these are things that are appealing to people of all demographic characteristics. A lot of younger people are really liking the downtown or the walkable ability to walk to work if they want to. They don't have to. And these changes will allow for those opportunities.
All right. Now, you referenced the master plan, of course. Folks, when the master plan is under review, have opportunities to contribute information and input for those. But there's also been some public input requested as it relates to housing, and you've been focused on that, right?
Yes, yes. And as I said, the master plan for 2018 has already accomplished some of the goals by putting these zoning districts in place. In the beginning of 2025, there was a plan done for the Lakeview district, the Lakeview Authority, taxing district. This money, the money collected by these taxes created the ability for us to do a plan. And this area is generally along the Beckley corridor that we're looking at adding a third or fourth mixed use district. Along there, it's primarily B2 and a lot of big box type development with big parking lots. And it's created a very car centric situation where changing that car centric situation where maybe some housing is built into those parking lots that have walkability to the stores and would make more sense. That plan was approved this year. It went out for a lot of public input, and that will be part of the update to the 2018 plan. And the other component that we are working on right now that we are doing outreach on is the one area that we really haven't touched on a lot. Some of our neighborhoods have lost a lot of housing over the years through demolition, fire, a lot of different situations. These neighborhoods could benefit from having some of these lots infilled.
Yeah, that's another kind of development, isn't it?
Right.
But you think of it just as much as you do the mixed use. The notion that
Absolutely.
some folks want to have that traditional structure on a lot with grass and gardens,
Exactly. Exactly.
and if there's space available to do that, now we're trying to figure out, I presume, how do we encourage a developer to build in those areas?
Right. And we also have neighborhoods that don't have infill that, what type of accessory structure? I mean, we all could use a little extra income, or we have a family member, a young adult that can't quite get a loan and is struggling to get into his or her groove in their job, and they don't, this opportunity to have accessory dwellings attached to the house or detached. Some people are interested. So we need to get more feedback on, are there opportunities for structures that look like single family units or are complementary to single family units that might be feasible for these neighborhoods for infill? Because what we run into is right now, because we have such a gap in the cost of construction and what the actual appraisal for the house and being able to get a loan, that gap is difficult to fill for a lot of people. And where there's a lot of different resources that our partners in the community are working on. Unfortunately, the city doesn't have anything to fill that gap, but we are working with those partners, right? But
Yeah.
what we can do is we can help to eliminate some of the obstacles to getting someone interested in coming in and building that housing. It may be difficult to attract someone to come in to build a single family house in those vacant lots because they're going to have too big of a gap in the cost of building. And however, if you maybe do a house that looks like a medium size house in the neighborhood and it fits the characteristics, and somehow you divide that into four very small micro units where four people can live. Maybe they're just single people and it's one bedroom, or a two unit that looks like a single family house. These are some of the things that we're trying to get a feel for in the different neighborhoods, and they're all going to be a little bit different in how they view that. And so we want to get more feedback. We've gotten a lot of great participation. We are looking for participation in a lot of different ways. And we have held 3 meetings so far. We will be holding another public participation meeting on February 19th at the Department of Public Works from 5:30 to 7:30. And our website for the housing strategy includes a lot of wonderful information that we have already generated through these meetings or as resources for residents to have a better understanding of what's happening, why it's happening. We have so many different levels of understanding about how and where we can fill this gap and what the zoning allows and what it doesn't allow and what that means for their neighborhood.
Yeah. Boy, We'll certainly, by the way, have the link to that website in the show notes for this episode. So look there and
Right.
click through if you're so inclined. I'm lingering on a few things that you talked about. First of all, the accessory building, the accessory unit maybe
Yes.
attached to a house. It sounds like we're talking about a watch or a pendant or something we're wearing, but it makes a lot of sense. In fact, I'm reminded of a similar example that you see a lot in New Orleans, where it's a single structure, but there's a space for an owner and then another unit that they may wish to rent that helps offset the mortgage payment. This sounds similar in concept to me as well, or maybe some folks think of the mother-in-law apartment or some kind of other independent space that's
Right.
part of the property. This is, I think, what we mean when we say, "Hey, think out of the box, come up with some new ideas."
Right.
This is what you're hearing about.
Yes, exactly. And we want to understand concerns about different type of housing and provide people with information. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and we're all passionate about our space in the world, and our neighborhoods are very important. And we want to make sure that we really understand what their different neighborhoods are comfortable with and what they're not. And again, these will in the end will be recommendations in the master plan, and we'll be putting together some surveys that kind of explain some of the questions we need to understand. We've had a lot of great discussion and activities where we talk about these different topics, and that information will be summarized as well. But I think the best way to get a final understanding is to have these surveys toward the end of the process so we can have all the information for people to review. They've participated, and we've had meetings with just that cover just the neighborhoods, and anybody's allowed to come in, but the activities are based on the neighborhood planning councils. And I think it's been really good for each of the councils that neighborhoods, they're all so different, so different. And there's been a lot of great communication among the different NPCs. And it really has, I think, created a much better understanding for me as a planner. And I think between the different neighborhoods. So right now, we're just trying to clarify, anytime you get an opportunity to express your opinion, you want to talk about everything in your neighborhood that concerns you. And we've had a lot of great conversations and made notes of that. But in the end, not now, but in the end, we want to focus on, we've got these over here. We know the things in the neighborhoods like sidewalks and, things that are very important to maintain and, lead-ins into the neighborhood. Buildings that are abandoned aren't going to attract people to the neighborhood, right? So those things are important. But the thing that we need to have to move forward in the final master plan is what type of units would be appropriate for infill,
All right.
aside from single family.
Yeah. So this underscores the information that you wish to have and the importance of that information from folks who are living in the neighborhoods of Battle Creek.
That's correct.
So take an opportunity if in February 2026 you have that chance. You're certainly invited. If you're hearing this after that, there'll be others. So click
What's that?
through. Yeah, click through to that website and see what the latest information is. Darcy, I suspect we will talk again over the course of the next several months as some of these things take place and the process moves along, and we look forward to that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Darcy Schmitt is the planning supervisor at the city of Battle Creek here on our BC City Connection housing series of podcasts. Subscribe where you get podcasts so you're alerted when these come about. Take care.